2020, the year everything changed. Today, I welcome Laura Tulchin from Exiger to talk about ESG, compliance, and we look into the future and how 2020 was the year that everything changed.
This is Bart Peterson, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
This is Dan DeMarco, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
The FCPA Compliance Report is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode, and you're in for a real treat today because I have with me Laura Tulchin. Laura is with Exiger, and we're going to have I think, fascinating talk about ESG. So, Laura, first of all, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Thank you, Tom. I'm so excited to be here.
Laura, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your professional background and add a few words about your academic background because it's a little different than most of us.
Sure, absolutely. So I am a director in the advisory business at Exiger. Exiger is a global leader in compliance and risk management solutions with hundreds of former banking compliance and general counsel, experts, investigations, and intelligence professionals, as well as 125 in-house developers and data scientists that support our experts and clients with award-winning tools across financial institutions, corporates, and government agencies. So we like to think of ourselves as experts plus technology combined. I have been with Exiger for over 7 years, so really since its founding, and I regularly work with financial institutions, multinationals, and government agencies in managing risk. I'm also currently getting my MBA at Columbia Business School, where I focus on ESG and sustainable business practices. Prior to Exiger, I lived for a number of years in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, where I was a Fulbright scholar and worked for Brookfield Asset Management. I also got my master's in political science down in Brazil. So I certainly, got a bit of an international background and can really speak in terms of how other developing nations and emerging countries kind of see business and ESG practices. I will say my Fulbright focused on the issue of racial quotas in the public university system down in Brazil. So I think just having had that incredible experience really has stayed with me all these years and informed kind of my viewpoint on, our topic today, ESG and some good business practices and what that looks like in 2021.
And that really brings us to our topic today, which of course is ESG. I've been surprised a little bit, but also pleased that there seems to be an explosion of interest in almost the regular media about ESG and into 2021, but you and Exiger have been talking about this for quite some time. So I was wondering why now is ESG gaining so much steam in the public arena as opposed to compliance or other arenas we've been talking about it for some time?
Yeah, definitely. Certainly you can't open the newspaper or the virtual newspaper these days without seeing a ton of information out there on ESG. I mean, I think it's a lot of different factors. I think, a large push for the past, let's say, 5-ish years have really been coming from investors, both institutional and otherwise, and activist shareholders and stakeholders taking an active lead in pushing investments to be ESG friendly. And I think what that means is changing as well, right? So that kind of started with simple screening out of negative companies. And I mean, that goes back decades, right? Where even kind of saw it starting with divestment efforts around apartheid or things of that nature, where you're simply saying, I don't want any money or any business going to this type of industry or this type of company, be it what it may be. I think that definition of ESG, and you can call it ESG, you can call it impact investing. I mean, those things have slightly different meanings, but really I do think there is an evolution there, right, of kind of coming into a more integrated, holistic way of thinking about investment and business so that you are weeding out negatively impacting ESG companies and or bringing in positive impact. And I think, right now, right, 2020, 2021, we're seeing this really blowing up. I mean, part of this is because in the past couple of years, 2020 in particular, you're seeing higher returns in the ESG space. So I think there was this statistic from August which showed that 64% of actively managed ESG funds are beating their benchmark versus 49% overall. I mean, that's kind of an amazing stat because if you think about it, if you just invest your money regularly, you kind of have a 50-50 chance of beating the market or your benchmark. If you invest well, right, if you invest in ESG, you've got a better chance. You're beating the odds. And I think that there's this kind of overall recognition that ESG is actually good for business. It's not just good for the world. It's good for your bottom line. I think there are a couple other factors which are making ESG just so important and much discussed these days. I mean, I think there is a role of employees internally in a lot of organizations that's really kind of taken on almost an activist position, really pushing employers to be ESG friendly. I think that's really interesting, really important. You can see that in a lot of different ways across a lot of different industries. And then there's also this public opinion aspect, right? So, making ESG commitments is seen as a way to not just attract and retain talent in terms of employees, but also kind of reach consumers, be it B2C or B2B. And, whether that's just kind of like a marketing ploy, I mean, that's a whole other discussion, but it certainly seems to be kind of top of mind in terms of how companies are going to the market and making themselves be, ESG risk averse and ESG value generation friendly.
Or perhaps we could take a step back and I could ask you, one, to define ESG, but then ask, are there any universal standards you or I could point listeners to, or is it right now various standards from various regulatory bodies literally across the globe?
Yeah, totally. Good question, Tom, and definitely important one to take a step back. I mean, my viewpoint is that it's kind of a truism to say today that ESG has no real definition. I mean, it means everything. And maybe to some people that means it means nothing, right? So it's the environment, the air we breathe, right? How we're thinking about climate change, as well as kind of the communities we take part in. That S, that social aspect of ESG, right? So ESG, environmental, social, and governance. That S can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And then that G, it's the rules that govern our organization. So there are just so many different ways about thinking about ESG. And I think one of the challenges we're seeing, and it's really kind of, I'm hearing it from clients today at Exiger, it's kind of bubbling to the forefront, is that there is no one golden standard in terms of how to measure ESG risk. We have kind of an alphabet soup, what they like to call it, of different disclosure bodies. So in the past decade, there have been a number of organizations that have come together really on a voluntary basis to kind of create different reporting metrics to show ESG risk and ESG performance. Some of these are kind of firmly in the client space, like the Carbon Disclosure Project. Some of these are really kind of broad, like the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals or the Principles for Responsible Investing, the PRI. But there are a bunch of them. And I think most of these disclosure bodies, they're all, good intentioned and really trying to kind of crack open this nut. But at this point, there are a lot of different ones that kind of maybe speak to different use cases and different industry needs and different nuances, but, kind of get to this point of overwhelming people with different standards, right? Which may or may not be commensurate with one another. On top of that, right? So you've got these big kind of disclosure bodies, most of which are international. On top of that, then you've got kind of, for-profit companies that are looking to sell their own methodologies on how to measure ESG. So those are a bunch of different companies that are going out to clients, financial institutions, multinationals, and saying, okay, you want to be conscious of ESG risk. We've got a way to measure it. The problem is there are a bunch of them, right? And they're not all doing it the same way, nor is that transparent. It's a internal methodology. And then even on top of that, you've got companies doing it saying, oh, we're just going to develop our own in-house proprietary methodologies of how to measure ESG. So there are a lot of complications here. There is no one golden standard of sort of, these are the metrics that you need to fulfill to say that you have a truly, comprehensive ESG program. I personally think, that's recognized as an issue. I mean, a few months ago, you saw two major disclosure bodies or sustainable accounting bodies, SASB and IIRC. They merged, kind of an explicit recognition that there does need to be some confluence of factors coming together in this area. So I do think, one way or another that we'll kind of get through this and define at least some minimally viable metrics that make up ESG. In the meantime, I think, there is kind of, a number of different ways of looking at what it means to be environmentally, socially, and government sort of risk minimizing and then value creating. Obviously, today, this is a lot easier to do when you're talking about measuring the performance or the risk of public companies, which have just so much more information out there from a disclosure perspective. I think private companies they still remain a little bit of a black box when it comes to how to measure ESG there. I know this is something I speak to my clients about, and Exiger, tries to use its technology on the unstructured data side to really be able to quantify or really measure how private companies are doing in the ESG space. But, I think this is where the industry is going, and it's probably the next big challenge in terms of what it means to measure ESG.
There's been one story in the news I really wanted to ask you about to see if you think it falls into ESG. I suppose I should tell you that I think it does, but I won't tell you which one. And that's the Goldman Sachs 100-hour work week. And when I read that, two things that struck me about that. One was negative or reputational damage to Goldman Sachs, but also one of the points you raised, which is employees are now speaking up about issues that are important to them. And I say that because I started private practice in a law firm, and although we didn't work 100-hour weeks, we worked 70 or 80-hour weeks, and that was just the way it was. No one said anything. And now you have very junior employees saying either this is not right, I'm not productive, or I don't like this in a very public way. Do you find that entire discussion falls within the parameters of ESG?
100% agree with you. And what I think is not getting enough attention in all of this conversation about ESG is that, your internal community is the best place to start. If you're a company that's publicly saying we want to be, ESG aligned, and we believe that sustainable business practices are the way of the future, and we care about our community and that S in terms of impact. Well, the easiest place to start that and really show that commitment is internally. And you can even think about things like employee resource groups, right? ERGs, or diversity and inclusion efforts. How does that really stack up in terms of the public facing, ESG commitment if you're not doing those things internally? And so, I absolutely agree with you. I think if you were to kind of look for some studies in this space, and I'm sure there are some, you would see that the companies that are kind of most community or employee oriented internally, right, that treat their people well, that care about that S when it comes to their own community internally, are the ones that are also bringing that message externally in their mission and their vision from a business external perspective. So I totally agree. I think it's a super interesting example. It's because to your point, right? Like, it's kind of like the power of social media and that aspect of, where does ESG just become reputational risk, which is something we can talk about. But it's also just, it's such a big company and these were fairly junior people. And it's like, okay, well, maybe people have a voice now to talk about, their internal community from an employer perspective where they didn't previously.
And also to pick up on one of your points with the various measurements, both private sector, public sector, and regulatory sector around ESG, it strikes me that there are different functions within a corporation that might claim ESG. And I know one of the conversations you and I have had in the past is why compliance really needs to take the lead. I was wondering if you could give us your thoughts on the disparate impact within a corporation and why we both think, or at least you think, compliance is well suited to take a lead role in this, really, or else.
Yeah, definitely. So, I think one of the challenges that a lot of companies are facing today, even, let's take the best company with the best intentions in this space, right? They want to do it right. Historically, ESG, again, because it can mean different things and has historically sort of meant different things, it's been managed across a number of different departments in a given organization, right? And those aren't always the same. That's not consistent. So you might see like a CSR, corporate social responsibility function, kind of historically done some of the ESG work. Or you might even see it in sort of like a procurement function, right? From a supply chain perspective or sustainability perspective. Today, they might be thinking about ESG. Again, compliance, right? So you've got all of it today. You've got ESG issues falling on the desk of a number of different departments, some of which, might be thinking about these things from different lens or different ways that may not come together for a truly aligned or commensurate approach when it comes to ESG. I think what we're seeing is that there definitely needs to be kind of a consolidation of that ownership of ESG risk, and compliance is certainly one of the best places to do it. Why? I think first and foremost, and it must be said, and we haven't touched on this yet, we're talking about ESG from an investor perspective or from a reputational perspective or from a returns perspective, employee perspective. But, ESG is very quickly becoming a regulatory issue. Just in the past month or so, President Biden announced that an enforcement task force in the SEC to ensure that companies are living up or really kind of making good on the public commitments they make in the ESG space. And we're seeing that globally, in 2021 and last month in February, Germany passed a law around ensuring that companies' supply chains are ESG friendly and comply with human rights regulations in that company. And in just this very month, the EU Sustainable Finance Disclosure regulations have come into effect, which essentially are asking companies to make sure that, again, any ESG commitments they're making in the public sphere are backed up by data. We're seeing this all over the world. And I believe, the U.S. has been a little behind on this subject, but is quickly catching up. So that regulatory aspect, right? It fits firmly within a compliance view of ESG. Not only is there that regulatory perspective, I think in terms of bringing ESG risk into kind of the mainstream everyday regular operations of how companies make risk decisions, compliance is very well positioned to do that. It's done it before. We know that compliance functions are historically skilled at both measuring risk, right, and sort of putting in those mechanisms to test, to control, to measure, to create KPIs, to really get that consistent data-driven view of compliance with a given, be it regulation that we're seeing or internal commitment. But compliance is also really good at sort of ensuring that is also adopted from sort of a hearts and minds perspective, right? Compliance understands that you cannot just ask people to change the way that they make decisions without proper training, without a tone from the top, without really those cultural reinforcements that bring about accountability. So when you think about ESG risk, right, and how to make sure that companies are really kind of living and breathing the commitments they're making, as well as their, upcoming and increasingly stringent regulatory obligations in this space, you need both that kind of measurement side to ensure sort of enforcement, but also that hearts and minds side. And I really think from my experience, working with compliance companies, it's all types of organizations, financial institutions, corporates, even you see it in government as well. Compliance is really kind of well positioned to get at ESG risk on both sides. And I'll just add, Tom, what I think is so amazing about this moment that we're living in is, ESG is becoming real, and we have an opportunity right now to kind of build a framework so that it's not just that lip service or that PR or that marketing ploy, that it really does change how we, as a society, as a global business community, conduct business. And if we can do it right, I'm very optimistic that we will be feeling those benefits, literally for generations to come. So I think now is the moment. We got to do it right. And if we do it well, here we come, world, we can take on some of these giant challenges facing us.
Well, one of the things that strikes me about compliance is that in many ways, the SOX 404 financial controls, the COSO internal controls framework form the backbone of a best practice compliance program. Could we take those same concepts we see in particularly the COSO framework and adapt those to ESG with perhaps even a compliance overlay?
Yeah, I think so. And to your point, right? So what is ESG? Maybe should we start calling ESG like GES? We're not just kidding, but that governance aspect has been that backbone of compliance programs. It's a backbone of what I've done at Exiger, right? Anything you want to do from a risk management perspective, you need to make sure that you've got the governance to embed that, to implement that correctly. And so I absolutely think that there are governance frameworks out there, right, that really can make sure that ESG commitments, again, be it however you're defining that commitment. It can be a regulatory requirement. It can be an internal commitment. It can be a stakeholder shareholder commitment, that you're really kind of complying with them in an end-to-end way. And I think that's what you're saying, Tom, right? So how to create these frameworks that are end-to-end and use controls and testing and such to ensure that they are living up to that commitment. And I completely agree, right? That governance aspect is absolutely huge here. It's embedded in what ESG is, and it's a real opportunity to make it real for a lot of companies around the world.
So we talked about measuring ESG, but you had another point, and I really like your phrase, the hearts and minds part. When you sit down across the table from a compliance officer or even a business executive or senior leadership about adopting ESG, how do you help them think through both delivering on the hearts and minds, but also communicating that and then measuring that going forward as well?
Yeah, and in one way, I think it's not so different than any other area of risk, right? So you do need, as we were just saying, you do need those same tools to really measure and ensure embeddedness. I think what's interesting about ESG from that kind of cultural adoption perspective is in some ways, I think it's actually easier. A lot of these issues, a lot of what ESG is our lived experience. And as opposed to some other areas of risk, which can feel slightly esoteric to people, right? ESG can be made real in pretty quickly because it touches everything we do as people who live in societies, be it in the U.S. or elsewhere. What I think can be a little challenging about that is, as kind of going back to our conversation on sort of these different metrics about what ESG is that can almost be a little overwhelming. So what I kind of, would I do urge my clients to do is to think a little bit about true measurable commitments. Because, some parts of ESG are fairly quantifiable. I think a lot of focus, and rightfully so, in my personal opinion, and recently has been on the E, on the climate side. And when it comes to kind of measuring climate impact, there actually are fairly sophisticated and mature measurements out there that can really quantify, what a company's environmental impact is. When it comes to some of those S things, like we were discussing, some of those social questions, you make a commitment to being, to believing in equity, gender equity. Well, what does that really mean? And so what I would say is, again, that can be easy from an adoption perspective. That can be a little hard from a measurement perspective. So I urge clients to think about those things from truly measurable perspectives, put a commitment around that, define it as it fits your business profile, as your business need. It's not going to be the same for everyone, and that's fine. But that hearts and minds, people will be able to adopt that commitment if they know what it really means, and defining it in a way that is measurable, realistic, time framed, and so on. I think, those two things really need to go together when you're talking about questions as sort of broad and socially impactful as some of the issues that come up when you talk about ESG.
We're now 1 year plus into the pandemic, and I was wondering how has the last year COVID-19 really changed either your approach or what you've seen in the market around ESG?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's changed a lot. I think it has accelerated this conversation, which was already picking up speed even before the pandemic. I mean, the first comment there, I think, what you saw in 2020 was that ESG outperformed the market. And I think, there was a lot of kind of chatter about that because people are saying, well, is that because they're ESG companies, or is that just because, ESG actually happens to be a lot of technology companies that aren't getting the same supply chain interruptions, and maybe that's just why, and we're, proving the wrong thesis here. I don't really think it matters, because what it does is it brings a focus on ESG resiliency, right? So I think if we have one word that came out of the pandemic, right, it's about business resiliency and business continuity. And that fits very firmly within a conversation about ESG, right? So you see that companies that are managing ESG risk well end up being those companies that are most resilient, that can most withstand shocks. And I mean, what greater shock was there than a year ago when we all abruptly, started staying home and completely changed our business practices. So I think this focus on resiliency, on what, the COVID pandemic has done to shift that conversation toward thinking about sustainable, resilient business practices, goes hand in glove with a conversation about managing ESG risk. And I think that companies are absolutely recognizing that, right? They're going from a place of, okay, I want to minimize, the risk that comes, be it in my third party population, in my supply chain. I want to minimize my ESG risk. And in doing so, I am going to increase my own resiliency, my own operational, resiliency, my operational health, my business continuity. And I think that's only a great thing moving forward, right? Whether this pandemic ends tomorrow, in 6 months, a year, I think that is a lesson that we will take with us. And is one of, hopefully, the silver linings that we have coming out of this challenging past year.
So where do you see ESG in 2025 or perhaps even into 2030?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question because, Larry Fink has famously said, climate risk is actually just like investment risk, right? ESG risk is just risk. And I do think, I don't know if we'll get there within a single decade, but I think a couple decades from now, that's where we'll be. The world is changing so rapidly, and some of these issues are going to be, really kind of our lived experience from a business perspective, and we will have to manage them whether we call them ESG or not. I think in a few years from now, if we're talking about 2025 or even 2030, it is possible that we'll be in a very different regulatory environment, even with the changes that I mentioned earlier. So it is, very possible that ESG becomes even more firmly rooted in a regulatory department or in a compliance department. Again, even more so, I think we're going to get to a point where we're thinking not just about ESG risk and minimizing that risk in our third parties or in our supply chain, but really thinking about ESG value generation, right? So instead of just making sure that I'm not, doing business with anyone involved in modern slavery or, harmful environmental practices, I'm going to start thinking about where I can do business so that I'm creating ESG value. And I think, that sort of continuum from risk to value generation, I think it's coming, to become, it's starting to become a little bit more popular and a little bit more front of mind for people. But I do think within 5 or 10 years, that is where we'll go. And I'm very much looking forward to it because I think really when you talk about ESG risk, then the next place to think about is ESG value generation, positive impact from an ESG perspective, how your business can do that, again, through its own practices, through its third party management, through its supply chain. And I think, in a few years from now, that will be a really mature and sophisticated, well-developed area of focus for companies.
Laura, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time for this episode, but I was wondering if our listeners wanted any more information on any of the topics we've discussed or any more information on yourself. Where could they go?
Yeah, so they can absolutely check out Exiger's website, exiger.com. But I really do encourage people to follow Exiger on LinkedIn to hear from our experts. That's really where we put in our expert commentary in a really easy to understand, easy to digest way. So check out Exiger on LinkedIn, and then for a lot more on this topic and other areas of risk management and risk mitigation.
Laura, this has just been a fascinating exploration of a wide variety of ESG topics. I hope that perhaps in the future I might be able to call upon you again for another exploration.
Definitely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tom.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report, a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. We have a great new show on the Compliance Podcast Network called Mo Forecast, which is a podcast of the law firm of Morrison & Forster, hosted by James Koukios. Check that out on the Compliance Podcast Network. Also, in the month of April on The Compliance Life, I'm featuring Jonathan Kellerman, partner at Stone Turn. He's had a fascinating career in healthcare compliance, culminating in the CCO chair at Allergan before he moved over to Stone Turn. So check out The Compliance Life on the Compliance Podcast Network. I hope you'll join me again next week for another episode of the award-winning FCPA Compliance Report.